Joining our speakers for the panel discussion are Mary Crane and David Quigley. Mary and David will each give a few minutes of remarks, followed by a discussion amongst those of us up here at the front. After this, I'll open it up to discussion amongst all of you as well. So I'm going to introduce Mary and David now. Mary Crane is the Thomas F. Radigan Professor of English at Boston College. She specializes in English Renaissance literature and culture, 1500 to 1660. Amongst her many publications on all sorts of topics, history of science and technology, cognitive literary theory. Her most recent book is Losing Touch with Nature, Literature and the New Science in 16th Century England. In addition, Mary is the director of the Institute for Liberal Arts at Boston College, which hosts conversations and supports programs that examine and advance liberal arts education and interdisciplinary dialogue. The Institute for Liberal Arts honors the Jesuit contribution to higher education by thinking seriously about the place of the liberal arts in the 21st century university. David Quigley is Professor of History and Provost and Dean of Faculties at Boston College. Previously, he served as the Dean of the College of Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. David's research and writing is on 19th century American history, focusing on the history of race and democracy. David played a significant role in the conceptualization and design of Stokes Hall, the Center of the Humanities at Boston College, and along with Mary Crane and others, was central in the ongoing effort to renew the undergraduate core curriculum at Boston College. David's interdisciplinary and cross-school collaborations are many. They include the Teachers for a New Era with the Lynch School of Education, the Portico program with the Carroll School of Management, and helping to develop new interdisciplinary majors in environmental studies and Islamic civilization and societies. So now I will hand it over to Mary.
Thanks, John. I just want to talk really briefly. So we've been hearing about the sort of uses and purposes of liberal arts education, and I want to just talk very briefly kind of about the techne of liberal arts pedagogy, because if you're at an undergraduate liberal arts institution, a question that looms as large as why is how. Especially because I think we live in a culture that's increasingly actually suspicious of expertise and suspicious of knowledge, and especially elitist knowledge, which we sort of acknowledge that liberal arts education can be associated with. So Boston College requires all undergraduates, even those in the School of Management and the School of Nursing, to take a large footprint of liberal arts courses. And our struggle has been to help students see why this is a good thing while they're in the midst of it. I think most people 10 years later our surveys show that they do start to see later on why it was a good thing. But in the midst of it, not so much. You can lead freshmen to the liberal arts, but you can't make them think, right? And so we've been thinking recently about how to do a better job of that, because people are spending so much money on the degree, and because parents especially have a tendency to think about it in sort of instrumental terms as, how is this going to contribute to careers? So Boston College has always had programs in the core, like Perspectives, like Pulse, that do help students see what it can do. And we created a group of new courses designed to kind of spread some of this really careful thinking about how to bring students along in kind of participating in their liberal arts education. And so one component of, I won't describe the courses, but one component that we offer in these courses is time for reflection, we call it. And there's one kind of course that actually has students meet in the evening every week for reflection, something we sort of copied from Perspectives. And then the other kind of course has students meet for reflection 4 times in the course of the semester. And I think we thought reflection is an important component of Jesuit liberal arts education. contributes to discernment, which is a term that has to do with, thinking about your life and your experiences. When we initially thought about reflection, one thing we thought it could be used for would be to help students understand how these courses could contribute to a career or work. And so we imagine people from the career services coming, alumni coming, and talking about how whatever was the topic of this course would contribute to careers. It turns out some people do that most faculty actually, if you look at what people have done, it's modeling productive, well, not productive, but leisure activities. So that people take students to the Museum of Fine Arts and they talk about what they've seen. They go to Symphony Hall. Some people have had them do yoga, journal writing. So it's turned out to be more focused on, obviously, because when you have time to reflect, it's in leisure activities. So, more of these courses than we expected focus on kind of attentiveness and how you spend your time and how you think about what you're doing. So, and they've been very successful. So I do think a kind of a, if our culture is going to come to value liberal arts education, it has to start with people we're actually educating while we're doing it. And with that, we have to be really attentive to how to create experiences that accomplish that. So that's my, in the midst of it, that's my thinking about it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mary.
Thanks, Mary and John. Let me just first begin by saying that I'm teaching one of these new core classes, had it at noon today, and had the pleasure of teaching the first and second inaugural of Lincoln, so I was very much moved by Russell. I can't say everybody was reading it for the intrinsic joy of 19th century political thought, but there was a little bit more pleasure, I think, among those first-year students engaging the material than I might have otherwise encountered, so something's working there. I want to thank John for bringing this together. I think, like many of the panelists, I've certainly been worrying about and gnashing teeth over the fate of the liberal arts for more than a decade at this point, but for a good long time. Actually, to throw work and leisure into the mix and think about how our current conversation, the Jeremiads, the defenses, all of that, the apologies come into view when we're thinking in terms of work and leisure has been helpful. And again, Mary's been a great co-conspirator, and especially thanks for the new life that she's helped breathe into conversations on campus and off about the liberal arts. When John, months ago, first raised the possibility of this conversation, two works that I haven't read in probably 25 years came to mind right away. I'm not quite sure why. One of them quite popular and quoted even to this day, mostly by people who've never read it, but Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, and the kind of concern about, 25 years ago, what's happening to leisure time, kind of sociability, kind of community in modern America, I think holds the test of time in some ways. A more despairing story is Our Children a few years ago, but of a piece with that earlier work. And I'm a 19th century historian, as you heard, and one of my favorite books from grad school was actually a social history of Worcester, of all places, 8 Hours for What You Will. Roy Rosenzweig, one of the great social historians of the last generation, died too soon. He was actually a candidate for a position here when he was coming out of grad school 40 years ago. But it's a book about the collective movement among working people in Worcester to give rise to the fight for 8 hours, an 8-hour day, but then also the conceptualization of leisure as something collective, as a community good. And I think I very often do, and I think they're really powerful talks that preceded us, think about leisure as individual, about the modern self, about the crisis of selfhood. I think that, at least for me, trying to imagine ways of linking up those individualized notions of leisure with that draw towards intramural sports or the choruses that can't quite hit the right note. I think that there's something really important there that I hope we can think through in the conversation. In the particular context of Jesuit Catholic education that David and Mary both referenced, I went back and looked. One of our colleagues, Cristiano Casalini, an Italian scholar who teaches in the Lynch School and is a fellow in our Institute for Advanced Jesuit Studies, wrote a piece around 5 years ago called Active Leisure. And it's focused on the first 100 years of Jesuit education, running from the middle of the 16th to the middle of the 17th centuries. And famously, for all of us across our disciplines, you know early Jesuit education, the college system, the kind of building on the humanistic tradition, the ratio studiorum, the liberal arts. I can go on all day about how the liberal arts play into those early Jesuit schools. What's striking, I knew some of this, John O'Malley, the great Jesuit historian at Georgetown, has been probing this mind for a while now, but Cristiano nails down the intentional and structured ways in which the first Jesuit schools built a series of really structured communal events, building towards festivals and other kind of end of semester or end of academic year performances of dramatic plays, music, all sorts of ways of thinking about how play, building on Kalpana's point, really is not separate from or distant from the work, but was structured in those Jesuits' minds to reinforce and build towards the formation, the educational goals that they were pursuing. Plays out in all sorts of different ways. The Jesuit schools are always overrepresented in the NCAA tournament. Sadly, BC not always represented among them, but the ways in which Jesuit schools have built on that tradition, sometimes in the arts, sometimes in physical activity, trying to think about how play is part of the larger civilizing or formative project of educational institutions, I think it is worth considering, especially in terms of that collective approach. Been thinking as a 19th century American historian the ways in which liberal arts education comes across the Atlantic and shows up in the college and then university system in North America is an interesting story, and the critiques of the last 10, 20 years were certainly anticipated in the 19th century as schools, not BC, but many other schools moved from a denominational founding towards a more secular orientation in the long 19th century. The worries about practicality, about the market, the training for citizenship, whatever it might be, are already in play throughout the 19th century. The kind of denominationalism across that period, the Morrill Act, the turn towards technical education, in many ways with positive outcomes, but there's a kind of questioning that runs through that period. And one of my more recent research interests, partly because of my day job, is kind of how do core curricula show up? When do Americans start debating and thinking about what a core curriculum should look like? David Haskin here is an expert on kind of English and some of the English curriculum wars, but it's in response to some of the earlier crises of the liberal arts that we find first at Columbia, more a few decades later at Chicago, elsewhere, some of the more interesting, sometimes imaginative, sometimes defensive, thinking about what liberal arts should look like and how it's a kind of training for life as you go along. In more recent times, of course, these things have only intensified the concerns because of the price tag for elite education, but a whole lot of other factors, and it's, again, not just one part of the American political spectrum. One of the more despairing moments of the last 10 years for folks of a political orientation like me is when President Obama had fun trashing art history degrees, among others. Why? What would be the value of pursuing art history in the second decade of the 21st century? So it's those crises persist, especially related to the world of the labor market in the sense of return on investment. I think as we imagine what the work of liberal arts for the future, imagining a liberal arts future, I would point to a few things. Certainly that sense that Mary's involved in, and I know folks, I think at each one of your institutions who are involved in thinking about the curriculum as a great resource. If there's one way where we actually reach something of a mass, even at an elite level, a mass audience with the liberal arts, it's what we're doing for 18 to 22-year-olds. How do we take fuller advantage of that as opposed to what we've typically done, which is punt on the curricular wars, or really trying to think through how do we have the greatest impact on students. Not saying that it's easy at any point, but I think that trying to imagine what we can how we could connect with that generation is critical. I think trying to think beyond the 22nd birthday in some ways. I mean, in some ways we're all talking about the preparation that it's going to pay off 10 years later. You see the value of the core, or sometime in our middle years we'll understand all of this. I think of recent conversations with the folks at edX, or all the people who are trying to blend all the techne with higher ed. This idea of lifelong learning, the cliche and jargon of all that, but what does it mean to think about lifelong liberal arts? How do we reach different publics? How do we all of the discussions, the Nussbaums and Delbancos and Menans and so many others who've been writing about liberal arts for the last decade plus, it's really been inside baseball, and they've been talking to those of us who teach liberal arts, reassuring us, shoring up our belief in what we're doing. How do we try to engage different publics? And there I would think some of the work being done, the Bard Prison Initiative is one that comes to mind. When I was a grad student, the New York Council for the Humanities had programs getting us out into the borough public libraries. You find things like that with the Clemente program here with Mass Humanities. I think what's needed at this moment in time is a greater imagination of the publics we deal with, including those on campus, but not limited to those, thinking across generations, and also the ways in which we can engage with a larger set of publics, looking out. Again, a lot of other comments I had, but I know the audience especially is interested in hearing from our three main presenters. I guess the last concluding comment, again, really still processing all the three main talks discussed, I hadn't had it in my mind as I came in today, but the opioid epidemic is kind of front of mind, having heard all three of you and the ways in which the crisis of leisure of a very different sort is before us. So again, what Bard Prison and similar programs around this country are doing for people who have nothing but, I don't want to call it leisure, but time on their hands, for stretching on into infinity in some cases, what can we learn as we think about, again, those who are earning their disability as a point of pride in some ways, and how do we engage in thinking about, is it a post-work future? Is it a future where we more seriously think about the values that underlie meaningful work and meaningful community? So thank you for the provocations, and I look forward to the back and forth.
Thank you. Thank you. That was wonderful. The issue you raised is actually one of the questions I wanted to pose to the panel in terms of, for lack of a better term, the PR problem. Because if so many universities are understandably looking at university education as a business. I mean, you can't stay in business unless you have money coming in, and parents may not necessarily be interested in, and most parents may not be interested in sending their students to get a liberal arts education. So how can we reach the public of parents, and then of course also the public of government officials? Just a quick anecdote, maybe you read in the news a couple weeks ago that University of Wisconsin is proposing to, it was one branch of it, is proposing to do away with 13 majors in the humanities and social sciences. So philosophy, English, history, German, Spanish, and there's a lot of backlash to this, but in my mind I'm thinking, okay, how can we communicate to the public of parents and the public of government officials? I'm curious as to others' thoughts on that.
And I would say an issue is that we're not necessarily the most trustworthy ambassadors for liberal arts education, because we're, at least, maybe not you so much, but we're self-interested. I mean, it's what we do for a living. So
Peter can be more objective about it.
Well, I know, like, why would I quote Mark Cuban of any, is he really quotable? But, the truth is, he has a big audience every week, right? So, I mean, I think it really goes to the heart of how we view education, and we've got some education scholars here, and, we forget that our public education system was designed really around factory work. It was designed to create a labor force, and the question is, what's the labor force of the future? I've always used this line, like, I think humans are kind of hardwired for pleasure, we're trained for work, but maybe we're educated for leisure. And, we should maybe rethink what higher ed is supposed to be about. I mean, if we just want kids to get jobs, I mean, you could probably create 6-week boot camps to teach kids plenty of things that they can go out and make a living doing, at least, for the foreseeable future. But this is going to change so rapidly. So, if they haven't been taught how to learn, then all the subsequent training that you do, would be sort of lost, right, in a way. So, it's hard to explain to people that every job that you're doing today, even something like computer coding, which just seems literally about as esoteric and like, oh, that'll never go away. And like, people are already writing algorithms to write algorithms. You know what I'm saying? That this work will go away as well. And we just have to keep going. I'm not one of those technophiles from Silicon Valley who will talk about the singularity and when the brain, when computers can think, do things that the brain could do even better. But I think we do have to prepare folks for a future where work is going to be changing rapidly, and I just don't know of anything better than the gym of the liberal arts. What could be better?
We're true believers. I think everybody up here is that skeptical public out there who are making their college selections this month with May 1st weighing down on all the universities, the stories we tell.
And
that public
my
is
daughter did study art history. It was an art history.
Yeah, so there's a real concern amongst several people, myself included, about, you mentioned this, the speed at which these advancements are happening. So technical advancements in particular. So one of them that comes to mind is Google Translate. So I don't know how many people use Google Translate, but so it's an extremely useful tool, and there's a great New York Times article about this, about how on one day it was giving pretty bad, awkward translations, and the next day it put tons of translators out of work because it was one software update. It was one particular software update that led to just really terrible translations with all sorts of words missing. To you could put in literature and it would do a serviceable job. So this is sort of just one overnight update, and that's a concern of mine in terms of educating the public about these issues, because in the past things just moved slower. So I know, Russ, you were talking about your student motivations at Dartmouth. Do you find that when they're coming in, that they're thinking about, they're probably not thinking about working multiple careers, or are they thinking about just their first job?
I think that students are thinking about how to distinguish themselves. They want to show the world that they're something special, and so that's what attracts them to a place like Dartmouth in the first place. They want to show that they have something that most people don't. That maybe it's intelligence or creativity or drive or work ethic or character, or some combination of all those. And in their early years, they want to distinguish themselves in some arena. So some don't try so hard to distinguish themselves in the classroom because they feel like they're doing it somewhere else. But some, there's some set of students who come in and what they want to do is distinguish themselves in my classroom. And then I think they want to go out into the world and have what they've accomplished in college reveal themselves to the broader world, to have a kind of power or capacity that others might value. We're anonymous. We're anonymous, and we need to make a name for ourselves. And it's especially true when you're young and no one knows who you are, what you're capable of, and you haven't accomplished anything. So I think they have a little bit of anxiety. They're not quite sure how good they are at things, at being human or at any particular technique, and they want to use college to reveal their force and their capacity. That can be kind of competitive endeavor, because I show myself to be special in relationship to you, and so I have to outdo you in the seminar room or something. And they're not. It's a different thing. Somehow it takes a lot of teaching effort to get people into the place where they feel their own wonder, feel their own desire to know, and then are willing to do the hard work that's involved in satisfying that desire. So I think it takes a lot of work in the first weeks of a class, to get any student into that place. And the best thing you can do, I think, as a teacher is try to maintain that attunement in yourself. Maintain the desire to know, maintain the rigorous application of your capacities to satisfy that desire, and reveal, as far as it's kind of possible, to others the satisfaction that comes with, answering that desire. So sort of watching you give your lecture is to see a human being animated by this desire and nourishing it, and that's inspiring. So I think that's what we have to do. There you could say students understand certain desires. Everybody, human beings have desires, and Those are all known. And the desires that they really understand are the desires for physical pleasure, physical satisfaction, whether it's food to sex, to sleep, to leather couches or something. And they understand the desire for status and respect, the desire to be seen by others, and the desire for power. And they have, by the time they get to me as freshmen, completely lost touch with the desire to know. And it's as natural, as Aristotle says, as the desire to eat. So when you have children, you notice this active desire. I was knocked over by it when my children were, say, were they 7 years old or 6 years old or 5 years old, and they would, where's the water going? When you'd open the drain in the bathtub. And they're like, what are you asking me that for? What do you need to know that for? I don't know, it's going in a pipe. Where does it go? They ask all these questions with no instrumental purpose whatsoever. It's obvious they have no need to know this stuff, but they want to understand it. And I think that, alas, I think formal education beats that curiosity out of them. And it's pretty well dead by the time they're in 5th or 6th grade. And they substitute for it a kind of compliance, doing what their teacher wants them to do. By the time they get to me, they are experts at figuring, what do you want on this paper? Like, I want you to think and reveal your thought. I don't know. What do you mean, what do I want? But I'm grading it. So I think we have to reawaken that desire by displaying, and I will look to you, because I think you have obviously a reputation here, and now I know why. To see a person who's maintained this desire into maturity and lived a life that's happy in part because of the skills they've developed that enable them to nourish and answer that desire. That's what we have to do.
So, yeah, I mean, I talk to my students about this as well, that if they went to a decent high school, they were probably taught to do tricks for treats. Sort of like the way, I taught my cat how to, give me a high five and things like this. And so you give them treats to do this. And there's that model in high school. So I know, David, you were referring to just general discussions about core curriculum pre-college. So I wonder if the national sense of the liberal arts begins with having the desire to know beaten out of you in high school, and how that can be fought against. Do you have thoughts on that, David, in terms of at the pre-college level? I mean, so I'm not sure if we should ask the question in terms of the students or the parents or both.
It's a great, very tough question. I mean, just within my local discipline of history, I mean, one of the things that historians, when we get together, worry about is if there's one AP experience, one of the top 2 or 3 AP experiences that students getting into our universities have experienced, it's AP US history, if not 2 or 3 of them. And the kind of work that they do in that AP course is so different from what they should experience in the kinds of introductory history courses that they'd have at the university level. In some ways, universities haven't grappled with that yet to figure that out and push back and reshape the conversation. We're dealing with a lot of students who get here who are either because of the quality of the teaching or just the death march through a textbook are sick and tired of the field by the time they get to the beginning. Even if there is some sense of wonder and curiosity that's still in them, history isn't going to be the outlet for that as they get there. So I think, going back across both the Bush and Obama administrations, what happened to curriculum and testing and kind of education more generally that this generation is a product of is something to worry about. I think that my wife and I are both products of small liberal arts colleges. Our oldest son, who's in college, is at one of those smaller than BC. Our middle son, who's making his decision over the next 3 weeks, is basically choosing between a bunch of them. So we are a family that truly believes in what can be achieved in those places, especially with liberal arts degrees, humanities degrees. Yet at the same time, it is clear that for all the attempts to diversify and achieve access and equity in the kind of construction of the entering class, there, even as the public presentation and language on those campuses is so much about a democratization of higher education, the reality is an elitism that David was open enough to describe, but most people on the faculty at those institutions, in the alumni body, among the parent body, are not don't have the language to discuss in meaningful ways. So I think that that's, in a personal way, one of those kind of challenges, while truly believing that that is a great pathway towards a meaningful life, a life of real rewards, spiritual kind of meaningful rewards in the long term. That piece that it is so far removed from what's going on in the public university system around New England, around the country, is something that I think, both as an educator, but also as a parent and citizen, I really struggle with.
So, just, you ask such an impossible question, in my mind, the PR question. I don't really have a clue about that, except this much. My understanding of public relations and marketing, minimal, that there are only a couple of available strategies. You either have the best product, or you have the cheapest product, or you have a different product, right? I take it, this is sort of the Apple was the third, the difference. You don't go with focus groups and then build your product around what the focus group says. You go what Steve Jobs thinks you should want. I mean, is that at all relevant? Maybe not, but I think that, and I think it was just indicated in a couple of comments as well, the notion that what we have to do is, we're not going to sell it to parents. I mean, I just think that's kind of crazy. I think we have to exhibit who we are and be unabashed about the fact that we're different and be welcoming and inviting, and then know full well that two things, one of which is optimistic, one of which is pessimistic. The pessimistic part is most people will say no. The optimistic part is somebody will say yes. I mean, that's the optimism I have every time I go into a classroom. I can do the numbers quickly. 98% totally uninterested finally, right? There for the, especially in these big intro courses, you know, they're there for the accreditation and everything we're familiar with. But there's always somebody out there who is different, who not everyone has had the love of learning beaten out of them. And the amazing thing to me about teaching is you never know who that person is in advance.
And then 10 years later, you were saying that your polls of the nursing program and the management program suggest that 10 years out, they do look back and say, wow, I'm glad we had those requirements acting on us. Is that right, Mary?
People have, yeah, even when they graduate, a lot of them will say they now see. And some people, even after they've taken the class, will say. So, I mean, our desire is to reach some of those 98.
Yeah, mine too.
Yeah.
But I don't know what else to do except, really it's what Socrates says about himself in the Apology. He says he's a paradigma, a paradigm, a display. I mean, a lot of times, you know, people in the humanities, you know, we lament. Well, it's on us. I mean, why can't we make it something pleasurable? A lot of times we're just, because we've been pigeonholed into these narrow scholarly little boxes, which is what's required for success at a research university, which, you know, it just isn't going to bring pleasure to the classroom. And there's so many structural problems and so many disincentives in a research university in particular to just against all of this, as you know. It's only the small liberal arts colleges, as you were saying, in my mind, that do offer this real alternative. But you know, if you're from them, I mean, even some of these places are increasingly transforming into mini research places. I mean, I taught at Williams for just 1 year as a visiting professor, and there was a really sharp distinction between some of the older folks there, you know, who were just there. That was their world, was that college. And then the younger folks, they were getting really significant release time from teaching so that they could keep up, right? And this was a tremendous tension at a teaching college, and one that I worried about. I mean, at a research university, my department certainly, everybody wants one thing, and that's to not be there, right? You know, you want sabbaticals, you want research time, you want time off. That's the goal of so much of the, that's the desire. And that's tough to fight at a research university because all the incentives are to survive is massive publication. So there's so many structural problems the
The
line.
ethos of research is taking over these institutions.
Even
It's not
the
just-
ones that, where, in terms of the mission of the very institution, it shouldn't be.
And that makes it harder to display the liberal arts in a way that's convincing.
I think so.
Is that just because all of your output, it has to be monetized one way or the other, whether it's in research grants or 3 takes up in the US News World Ranking,
Yes.
and that's something,
Yes.
Is it US News that's making this research ethos?
It's a big part of it. I mean,
Expand.
the most staggering and demoralizing thing when I was chair of my department was, I started to realize that when it came to tenure cases and anything like that, nobody ever read anything. The only thing that mattered was you just put the research on a scale that had some kind of prestige weight. And if it tipped in your favor, then you got tenure. Did anybody ever say, wow, what a great article? Oh, guy or woman only published one article, but it's beautiful. That's an absurdity. It's like, did you publish in the top journal? Monetized. Yes, that's a big problem.
I see, especially in our younger faculty, a movement away from that. We've always valued teaching. We're kind of in between the research university and this is our brand, that we're both. But especially younger faculty now, we just did a hire this year. Teaching, as the prestige of humanities fields has gone down, teaching has become more important. And also kinds of writing that appeals to a broader audience has become more important. So we saw a lot of applicants who had taught and spoke very thoughtfully about teaching and spoke very thoughtfully about how to reach the 98 students. So I think there's a change.
I wonder if the distribution of income, the changing distribution of income in the United States, to take an America-centric view, Peter, is also affecting the way students experience the liberal arts and their education. A generation ago, the difference between a high school principal and a banker, I'm sure there was a difference in salary. I'm not going to pretend I know, but I bet it was a factor of 2 or 3. And now it's a factor of 200 or 300. And the difference between making it into the top 1% and not quite getting into the top 1% is substantial. It has a very substantial effect on the way you live. And so students who are ambitious and who think there's something special, and they now know that they have the sunny side of the street is much harder to get a house on, and to just fall into the 75th percentile of the distribution is to be much farther behind the top than it used to be, and that puts some pressure, I think, on the education. Is this education going to equip me to compete successfully in a world where the stakes are really high? It's hard to be a romantic. I love your romantic spirit about this, and it's inspiring and affirming. But I think it's hard for some 19-year-olds. They ought to be more romantic than the 50-year-olds or 60-year-olds, but they aren't. They're very worldly and
They have it worse.
anxious.
They just
Yeah.
have it worse than I ever did.
Yeah.
but you're right, because they look around and see competition everywhere.
Everywhere.
And if I asked you what percentage of your application pool comes from overseas today versus 35 years ago, and you're like, what do you, well, you could fill the whole class with international students today from applicants, and they're all probably pretty good.
Yeah.
And I think globalization has made everybody aware of just the hyper competition and the fact that, that you compete. What was the great line from, I think it was Bill Gates, when he was asked to, he said, back in 1970, if you could be a genius in Shanghai or average in Poughkeepsie, I would have taken average in Poughkeepsie, because you would have been able to probably live a better life. And he said, today, if you're a genius in Shanghai, you could be the richest person in the world. These billions of people cut off from the global economy, and now they're all competing. And it's daunting if you're 18 years old, right?
Yeah.
I think you look at,
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Well, I think just because of time, let's take some questions from the audience. I know there's some. Yeah, Amy.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I missed the earlier part of your discussion, but there seem to be 2 things that are really a problem to me. That I haven't heard mentioned yet is the cost of a college education. It seems to me that you've priced yourself out of the market for the liberal arts because, I mean, the goal of the liberal arts is to make somebody who's happy, and there's nobody no employer is going to pay you to do what makes you happy. So that seems to be a big difficulty. I went to a tiny liberal arts college, and I worked my way through, and I came out with no debt. And I can't imagine now thinking that, you know, it would just be so impractical to come out with a degree that I didn't know what I was really going to do with in the marketplace, and with this huge burden of debt on top of it. So that just seems to be a practical impossibility. And the other problem seems to be a kind of political tilt in the liberal arts that have prevented half of the population from wanting to become part of your enterprise, because they look at it, they've already been exposed to enough in their high school teachers, and they're afraid that they don't want to put, for one thing, that this huge investment they've made, they don't want to put it in the hands of ideologues. And I know more and more conservative Catholic parents and their children who wouldn't approach the liberal arts at all, and if they're going to go to college, it's just going to get to get an engineering degree. And these are bright, interesting, really people that really want to know, and they're interested in moral and ethical questions, but they won't become a part of these institutions.
And I think that the politicization of the curriculum and of the faculty are self-inflicted wounds. They really do disable the ability to present convincingly what we do to the broad public. The university, should be a nonpartisan institution. Sam Abrams, political scientist Sam Abrams at I think SUNY Albany, has a study that shows that the liberal conservative ratio at northeastern private universities and colleges is 28-1. Public universities in the Midwest, 2-1. I kind of expect 2-1, because you expect people who are, Socratic types walking around, doing nothing with their lives except thinking and studying and stuff instead of being useful. Maybe they're going to be a little more liberal than the average mechanic out there. But maybe 2-1, it should seem plausible. But 28-1, that needs to be explained, and no one cares. No one thinks it even needs to be explained, much less corrected. So I think that is a profoundly worrying development. I mean, that's a catastrophe.
Chris?
Along the same lines, I kid you not, liberal arts in most of this country, those two words do not have positive connotations. No, I mean, I was talking to a guy from Oklahoma. He said, where I'm from, we say liberal arts. They're like, liberal arts? Why would we? So it's sort of a nomenclature problem in some way. I mean, that feeds into it. I mean, I'm serious. People don't know what we mean by liberal arts. How many times do we have to explain to the students what we mean by liberal arts? That it's, well, all the different theories of it. But just that, the way we even present it as liberal arts isn't helping.
I think the ideological piece is certainly a challenge and something that, again, people aren't really confronting. Let me take the other piece, which is the arts and what's included, and get back to David's first point about the domination of the sciences, which I think everybody in this room is probably worried about. But as someone who's certainly encouraging and supportive of the investments in the sciences, the hope is to have some kind of integration, and especially to encourage in our science faculty, some of whom are teaching with some of the humanists in this room, more of an understanding of themselves as engaged in liberal arts education. I think one of the worries at places like Williams, BC, BU, Dartmouth, across the board, is a tendency for them to kind of live on separate campuses in some cases, certainly and very often in shinier new buildings, but also to feel that they have nothing to do with the larger project and mission of the university. So again, by no means have we solved this. This is the great challenge, I think, of the next 100 years on this campus, and we're just stumbling towards some solutions, but trying to imagine ways of imagining science work, science teaching, science research is somehow involved in what the liberal arts are. I think we, not just here, but across the whole higher ed field.
But the odd thing is that they are part of it.
Wonder, awe, discovery.
Liberal arts and science. If you look at you know, the trivium and quadrivium. What do you got? Astronomy, which is supposed to be science. You've got math, geometry, right? That's,
So it's almost like, I mean, this is thinking about marketing and the terminology. Maybe we should call this not the liberal arts, but the freeing arts or something like that. Americans love freedom, right?
yeah. Wait a minute. I mean,
Like
call it,
freedom
wait, to be
fries,
fair,
freedom arts.
but wait a minute. Most of the almost every university has the College of Arts and Sciences, and that's where.
Why don't we call them the Second Amendment arts? So,
Another question over here.
So, talking about like just, you know, that average like 19 or 18-year-old that wants to or doesn't want to study liberal arts, it kind of hits right home. The flip side of a lot of like what's been talking here is, you know, those students that actually do want to kind of engage in liberal arts in the undergraduate. I guess the problem I've been having for a while now is how do I equate, you know, my wanting to know about a certain major and wanting to kind of do that for a long time in a very focused way, but also equate that with the societal kind of pressure / need to be competitive in the marketplace, have an affluent career, and just kind of be a part, like partake in this technical world. And, you know, equating those two things that might seem contradictory to each other is basically like what's been on my mind for the past couple of months. And so, I don't know.
yeah, my answer to that would be, if you're going to be a success in any way, in terms of your affluence or your achievements, you've got to find work you really like to do, because then you'll do, it's the only hope you have for do excellent work. That I take to be our job. We're supposed to expose you to enough stuff so that you find out what's the work you like to do. Maybe it's French literature, maybe it's biology, maybe it's engineering. But, you know, you'll know when you find it, because you'll wake up in the morning and that's what you want to do. It's not a burden imposed on you from the outside. There's this transition that a lot of students go through from where they come to college and they use the word homework, right? And homework is high school, burden, don't like it. Then it shifts to work. And you wake up and that's what you want to do. And then you start making decisions so that when you wake up in the morning, you'll be ready to go to work. So you don't stay out so late. Not because you're exerting discipline and refusing certain kinds of pleasures, but because you want to be energized when you go to work. That's our job, is to help you find that. And I think the best way we do that is through genuine liberty, give you freedom to choose to look around, and you'll find it out.
But I wonder if we're not doing enough on the matching function to match, you know, students with jobs and with firms. Our career services is, I think, often a very sleepy part of campus. And maybe that needs to be really reworked and rethought, and we need to perhaps take a kind of disruptive and entrepreneurial approach to making that match. We sort of assume, you know, that students will figure out how to build the bridge from talking about Aristotle in our seminar to, you know, a role in either the finance function or the marketing function or the operations function or the engineering function in a firm. If you want to go into a technology firm, there are only a limited number of functions in most of those firms. And if you're not an engineer, a very limited number of functions. So we're assuming that this guy's going to be able to figure out how to build that bridge all by himself, and not offer him a lot of help, I think.
I don't think he needs that much help. I think
I
he'll do fine. But I think what's going to happen when he graduates is you're going to bounce around. It might be miserable. It might be struggle for a few years. But maybe you'll. It's not that hard.
I'm going to stand up for the proposition that we might at least investigate rethinking the career services function, you know, offices in these liberal arts colleges.
You know, we keep forgetting that all of our colleges in the US are essentially liberal arts and science. Everything has distribution requirements, even if you're a management student. And I think, you know, we're hard on ourselves, because if you go to Oxford or Cambridge and you want to be a history major, this poor kid's got to study history for 3 years, and then a year into it, it's you know, I don't think I want to do. Well, if you don't like that, you're going to start at the beginning of another discipline, which is the same 3-year deep dive bachelor degree. So I mean, believe it or not, I think American undergrads don't realize they have a freedom that's almost unsurpassed, around the world. Actually doesn't exist anywhere else. I think there's maybe 100-odd or 200-odd liberal arts colleges in the entire universe of higher education institutions outside the US. The rest are 3-year deep dives in one subject. And you have to make that decision probably when you're like 16 or 17 that you're going to track for that university degree. And the worst thing is that so many systems, let's say like the Chinese system, you take the equivalent of the SAT. If you don't score high enough, not only do you not go to the school that you want to go to, you might not study the subject. You didn't score high enough to get in the subject that you wanted. I mean, that's just very, very different. So in that respect, I think even the most illiberal liberal arts school in the US, you're actually getting a depth of coverage that you probably won't get anywhere else. I just don't know if, I think you're absolutely right. You're supposed to shop around and find what you like. And we do that. I think we do an okay job of that, no? I'm the eternal optimist. I can't.
No, well, I think the structure is there. I mean, but I have this conversation with students every year. I mean, and I have nothing but empathy for the students because they're scared. They're just scared out of their wits. And they need to have some courage to look around.
That's what we should
Boston
teach.
College-
I mean, most college students, undergraduates in the country are studying communications, which is a pre-marketing, sort of marketing style degree, I think, or business, which is a sort of accounting style degree. It's a minority of undergraduates in the country who are in liberal arts degrees. And I think, those of us who are in these institutions and who cherish these institutions need to love them. And I think we really do need to connect this education to the world of work a little bit more skillfully.
To Russ's point, I mean, so Boston College has this program called the Endeavor Program. Mary, are you involved with Endeavor?
I just know about it, but all sorts of colleges and universities, liberal arts institutions now, by necessity, are doing more of that bridging, and we certainly have been. There's Catalyst, there's Endeavor, there's the school
Just to jump
management.
onto Peter's idea about optimism in this moment and trying to articulate, which I think these institutions, we need to be much more full-throated in making the case, as David is leading the way for the value of all of this. One model out there where you've seen some really interesting convergence of leisure and the liberal arts are what's happening to some of the more interesting new museums or museums that have been rethought in the last few years, certainly in the history space, I think of that, but across the country in terms of revitalizing communities and reaching out to people in interesting ways. I think there's a larger public, it might not be 100% that we're going to reach, but there's a larger public that's looking for meaning, again, coming together, not just as isolated individuals, but the museum and trying to think about the liberating possibilities of leisure time, I think are something that we in the humanities could probably draw some lessons from.
So maybe the liberating arts is a better. Yeah. So I think we're out of time. Let's give a round of applause.